Ann Walsh, CIO at Guggenheim, sees a COVID echo in the U.S. economy with high inflation and an overloaded debt load that will be difficult to unwind.
There are a number of cross currents that are happening that we haven't seen before. And I can kind of point to being in a post-COVID world. I almost call this a COVID echo because we're still recovering from all of the changed policies and programs and reactions by policymakers.
How inflationary are some of the policies that were put into place perhaps during COVID that, to your point, we have not seen even play out yet?
This huge amount of spending, we have to now pay the interest cost on that. And there's a crowding out effect with regard to how capital can be deployed. One of the biggest elements I've seen coming out of this sort of post-COVID or COVID echo period is the unevenness of the application of capital. Normally, what happens in an environment where the Fed is on hold, tightening and later on hold, is that capital gets rationed. And capital goes to then fund only the most deserving of business enterprises and opportunities. In an environment where there's just so much capital flowing and so much liquidity, you continue to see the uneven deployment of capital.
How uneven is capital being deployed right now?
We have a very bifurcated economy right now. We have the large businesses with access to capital. We have the wealth class in America. And then we also have the working class that doesn't have either investment in equities or savings, can't own a house yet because of the cost of capital. And small and mid-sized businesses that don't have the same access to capital, and their cost is substantially higher when they can access capital. So the sort of bifurcated economy that exists, all made worse by the two policies that the Fed has, higher rates and quantitative tightening. And it's going to continue as long as the yield curve remains inverted and the policies of the Fed are not yet to the point of lowering rates.
That bifurcation between the haves and the have-nots, how exactly is that playing out in society? Because this dynamic has been going on for a while now. You're really just starting to see the effects of what it means for the big to get even bigger.
If you want to go all the way back to pre-COVID, at that time, the Fed was even talking about trying to create, remember, they have a dual mandate, right? So stable employment, stable prices. Pre-COVID, they were spending a lot more time concerning themselves with this divergence, if you will, of different earners and the underemployed, and this dichotomy that existed. I haven't heard a thing from the Fed in the last 2 years about this issue and what some call the K-shaped economy. And it'll be interesting to see if their rhetoric returns to concerning themselves with the underemployed or the under-earning part of the economy.
When the Fed raises interest rates, it's a blunt tool. It impacts everybody, but to your point, because of what pocketbooks look like, it impacts people differently. Now that we are years into this fresh monetary experiment, how does it look?
If I were at the Fed, I would be thinking about the tools that we have in the toolkit differently. I would be utilizing quantitative tightening, and to a great extent, they have. Post-COVID, $12 trillion came into the global economy from central banks everywhere. And right now, we've seen about $5 trillion has been hoovered back out. That still leaves $7 trillion sloshing around in the system globally relative to where we were before COVID. Now, adjusting that for, larger GDP and GDP growth globally, probably we need to see about $3 trillion more come out before we get to an equilibrium of where we were before COVID. I don't think the Fed really appreciates the quantitative tightening tool as much as I do, and I think as much as the markets do. Relatively speaking to their adherence to rates as like almost the only tool. It seems to me it's a very blunt instrument.
Is there a way for the Fed to more surgically target the ability to balance the haves and the have-nots?
I do think rates are important here. I believe rates should be coming down. I believe they should have come down faster. They raised rates 75 basis points after SVB failed. That's unprecedented in Fed policy action ever, to actually continue to raise rates after we've had a crisis or a moment, if you want to call it that. And so as a result, they could take that 75 basis points right off and put us back where we were in March of 2023. I think they should do that.
If we take a big step back here, you were talking about the haves and the have-nots and that widening. How much does that mean the government has to step up in the future?
Well, I think the government's already stepped up a lot. I'd like to see us spend a whole lot less. What we have done is we've moved, and by the way, I think the Fed's moved this way too, into a world of industrial policy and using large sums of money to address and advance various political and or policy causes.
If you were worried about the current U.S. debt burden, what trajectory on? Where do we end up 5-10 years from now if we stay on this path? What does the world look like?
Those of us who have been in the investment world for decades, as we have, we look at this and go, this is unsustainable. But so far it has been sustained. And as long as we can remain in some sort of equilibrium where we can afford the cost of debt and we can afford the debt burden, then we're going to stay here. We have the reserve currency, and I think that actually supports that narrative. Having said all that, the cost of the debt at this level of rates of interest is too high. And as it's crowding out even defense spending.
Is what you're saying also that part of the problem is we are still reliant on, as we started this conversation, that post-COVID hangover?
You know, it's Ronald Reagan said, once you have a federal policy, you can't get rid of it, or a federal program. And the truth is that that's sort of where we find ourselves. It's worked so far, so why not keep going? And that's why I say it works until it doesn't. And I think it's going to take, I mentioned gray swans. Gray swans are events that happen that aren't quite black swans, but they seem to happen in more frequency than a black swan. It could take a black swan event. I don't know what a black swan event would look like, but it could take something fairly significant for us to realize that we have depleted our ability to continue to spend endlessly.
I'm Shonali Bassick. This is Bloomberg.